Update. Next, the official inquiry into the UK's pandemic preparedness has been launched by its chair, Baroness Hallett. The UK COVID-19 inquiry will begin preliminary hearings this year, and the first witnesses will be called next spring. I asked our health correspondent Jim Reid what would be looked at here.
It's absolutely huge. It's going to look at everything, not just in fact what we've seen over the last 2 years, but also the run-up to the pandemic, whether the country was properly prepared for an outbreak like we saw with COVID. And it's all being chaired, all being led by a retired appeal court judge, Heather Hallett, Lady Hallett, as she's called. At the moment, little known in this country. I'd imagine by this time next year, this time in 18 months' time, she'll become a very familiar face to viewers on TV news programmes. But she was speaking for the first time today in her capacity as chair, and that's because it was the official opening or the mark that kind of started this process. It was a recorded statement. This is what she had to say.
I know that others have suffered significant loss too as a result of the pandemic, and every person has had their life changed to some extent. For my part, I will do my very best to undertake the inquiry in a way that acknowledges this suffering and seeks to reduce the scope for others to suffer in the same way in the future.
Jim, interesting hearing those words, and as you point out, the scope of this is so huge, so much to look at. You just look at the figures now for people with COVID at the moment. This is still ongoing for many people in a very real way. I imagine the families of those relatives who've died, the battle here is to make sure they are central to what's going on here.
Very much so. I mean, in the last kind of hour or so, we've had some comments from the COVID bereaved Families for Justice campaign, which is the organised campaign that represents many of those families. Joe Goodman, the person that founded that campaign, talking about how today is a very emotional day for him because you're starting to see this process of hopefully learning from what went on over the last couple of years. But he makes that point that to be successful, this is going to have to bring the experience of those families into the actual public inquiry itself, which is going to be a very difficult thing to do when you think how broad this process is. You look at other public inquiries, so you look at something like Hillsborough or the Shipman inquiry. They looked at very complex issues, but they were quite focused on one event. This could cover everything from what went on in care homes to what went on in the NHS to how prepared the country was to the political decisions that were taken, the decisions around lockdown. I mean, each of those individually is very, very complex, which is why what they're doing is they're splitting it up, this public inquiry, into what are called modules. So they're starting to take this bit by bit. The first one they're looking at actually is preparedness for the pandemic and whether this country was ready enough. That starts taking some evidence in September and really gets going with public hearings in the spring of next year.